This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
Certainly the following conversation, of course, may be sensitive to some, but, it's uncomfortable, but it is, where we need to have open, honest, frank conversations. We, of course, reflect on the murder of Muhsin Hendricks, aged 58 years old. He identified as the world's first openly gay Imam, and of course openly gay Imam is the bit that has made the Muslim community uncomfortable for the longest time. He was shot in what appears to be an assassination hit in Bethelsdorp in Kabarga on the morning of Saturday the 15th of February 2024. Speculation about the cause or the motivation for his murder is of course rife at this time, with many drawing conclusions that it's probably on account of his sexual orientation being quite public, and being suggesting that being Muslim and accepting that is fine, that may have caused his murder. While to the flip side of this, there's a bit that we simply don't know, and even the police have not speculated yet to suggest that it was what in the mainstream would be called a hate crime. The video that's been making the rounds, for all of us to have seen, if you haven't seen it yet, it was a Toyota Hilux double cab bakkie that pulled up in front of the vehicle that Muhsin had been driving. Two men got out. One fired several shots through the vehicle, the T-Roc vehicle that Muhsin had been in at the time. And certainly on Sunday afternoon, by Sunday afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Sipukazi Mawisa from the police declined to share any more information about the whereabouts of the shooter, the driver of the vehicle, and so on and so forth. The responses have been very interesting, and they vary and they differ from person to person that you talk to. But I was reading out a bit earlier, and I'll read it out again. This is an article in the Daily Maverick by activist Zaki Ahmad. And Zaki says the following: Imam Muhsin Hendricks has been executed in the name of Islam. Muhsin was killed because he was Muslim and gay. His cowardly assassins have not yet shown their faces. They are part of a cult of death and hate. In my view, they are a dangerous minority bent on the destruction of people and institutions they brand as anti-Islam. Zaki Ahmad continues to say that his executioners are not the majority of Muslims who care about every living being on earth, including every human person, concluding, of course, with his condolences. When he was asked to elaborate on the claim that Hendricks was executed in the name of Islam, Zaki Ahmad proceeded to tell Daily Maverick that in the same way that Donald Trump strokes the violence of white supremacists, transphobes, misogynists, Islamophobes and xenophobes, the leadership of the Muslim community has spread hate. Zaki qualifies this by saying the climate of hate created by the fatwas of the Muslim Judicial Council and the Jamiatul Ulama creates fertile ground for small groups of fanatics who have attacked the LGBTQI community and other Muslims and people of Jewish people, is what Zaki Ahmad so does say. And then he says, think back to the bombs and the executions by Pagan and Qibla in the 1990s. Those who sow terror, hate and discord are a minority who use violence to silence the whole Muslim community. Our state must take action before this minority gains a foothold, is that particular article in the Daily Maverick. I've been thinking about this for the longest time because my immediate response was to say, no, you cannot go around assassinating people with whom you disagree with. But there are Muslims, and we've seen it in the comments and social media and so on, that seemingly says that this was brought upon by spreading that which is clearly in opposition to what Islam jurisprudence and Islamic, theology so does state, and also Islamic premise in Quran and so on and so forth. And so how do Muslims respond? Are they supposed to respond? In which way does one check your ethics and your religious prejudices, or otherwise, your actual religious fundamentals, so as to not pollute that but still have some sort of a response? Let's now welcome Dr. Shahid Mathee from the Department of Religion Studies at the University of Johannesburg, joining of course us now via online. Assalamu alaikum to you, Sheikh, and thank you very much for your time.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, Tashreeq, to you and the listeners of Radio 786.
Does this moment require us to revisit matters of homosexuality, or, is it about tolerance? Is it about death, and in which circumstance death can be justified? In which direction does this conversation pull you at the moment?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The first part of your question, does it require us, to revisit the question? Dialogue, let's put it under the general heading of dialogue. Dialogue is always necessary. It's a very fundamental Quranic concept. Allah, if we want, had dialogue with the devil when he commanded all the angels to do sujood to Adam. And he asked the devil. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Anbiya, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, call the people of the book. Let us have an understanding. Even to the mushrikeen of Quraysh in Surah Saba, Surah number 34, we read, say, let's talk. That's the meaning of the ayah. And let us say, Tashreeq, for yourself as the station manager and a long part of the time part of Radio 786, this is not strange to 786. Just 2.5 months ago, I think 2 months ago, Radio 786 discussed this matter. So Radio 786 has to be commended for always taking up these questions. So the question should not even be coming to, say, for example, Radio 786, because you always have these discussions. Frank, you called it in the beginning, frank, uncomfortable. So there is no, so yes, yes, and to say that we're exactly in a platform that has been doing this for the past, 25, 30 years, and it is continued. And just 2 months ago, if you recall, Tashreeq, we had this very discussion on the question of what is called homosexuality.
Absolutely. And of course, while these are matters and things that I think, often then confronts households and families and the public discourse, as it were, the question then, arises from this moment to ask, the way in which one ought to then process what has happened here to Muhsin. Of course, the claim by the mainstream media and commentators, etc., is, and as we listen there to the commentary of Zaki Ahmad, that it is the fanaticism and the fatwas and things that almost dethroned Muhsin as an imam, saying that he could not be an imam and be publicly gay and advocate for that sort of thing. That so on the one end, of course, I hear the argument here that preservation of life, even if you disagree with somebody, is sacrosanct, and then to the other bit you hear the yeah but argument, and so I'm wondering, how does one, from a ethical, religious standpoint, begin to assess what sort of questions should I be asking myself in forming a position on what has occurred?
I think to start with the point you raised, ethical, ethical grounds. Let me say, as human beings, Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, so we are bound by ethical and methodological considerations. With methodology, I mean that when we say something, when we diagnose something, we must do it according to a certain pattern. Now, just quickly if you'll allow me to comment on what Zaki Ahmad said. Again, the question is, how do you just find out that this is a group of Islamic fanatics, or Muslim fanatics, albeit a minority, when there has been no investigations? And I'm saying this as to the identity of the people who killed Muhsin Hendricks. Now, I'm not here adopting an apologetic one and say it's not Muslims, but at the same time, methodology and ethics demand of us, or rather impose on us, to say that when I pinpoint somebody as the alleged perpetrator of a crime, and let us be clear, I think that this was a crime, killing Muhsin. Let's be clear about that. But as to who the perpetrators of this crime were, that we need to have evidence, clear evidence. This is human. It's not just being Muslim. And even in the Muslim worldview, even in the Islamic, the Sharia, that when we say a certain person killed or a certain person did that, I am bound to produce evidence. The Prophet says, Al-bayyinatu al-mudda'i. And this is the problem with ideology. So Zaki Ahmad's statement reeks of a particular ideological view that finds people guilty before we've even done an investigation. But to your question, yes, of course, we can refer to fatwas that are given not only by ulama bodies in South Africa, by ulama bodies all over the world, and not only fatwas. Muslims having discussed this matter on the question of so-called homosexuality. When, as a Muslim, I say the Quran says it's not permissible, and somebody gets killed, how does one draw a logical conclusion between that and the murder of a person? And this is an unethical. It is not methodological. Simply because a person said alcohol, for example, is haram in Islam, and somebody kills a person who either sells alcohol or drinks alcohol, then the logical conclusion is that it must be a Muslim or the person who said that, who did that. So those are questions that we have to look at. Yes. So I think it's very, very important and part of this dialogue to say, look, let us understand how Muslims think. What is the paradigm in which Muslims think? The Quran, the Sunnah, we all know that. And that when Muslims pronounce, whether they give fatwas or just have discussions, fatwas, of course, from people have certain qualifications. And then we must now ask, then does it mean that if something may happen, we assume something may happen because of a particular fatwa, because a view that's expressed? Now the question is going to be, and as you read from the report, is that the law must take its course. Yes, law must take its course. The South African government and the police must find the perpetrators of this crime. But now to say something bigger, to say that now the South African government and the state and the police must clamp down on what comes to discussion on questions such as what are called homosexuality. This is taking it out of the ambit of this particular horrific crime. And it was wrong what happened to Muhsin Hendricks.
The challenge, of course, with what we sit right now is that this was somebody that was killed because he was not just, a person that self-identified as queer or homosexual, but he also was somebody that had, been open to marrying persons that may want to do so. And in the process you have, of course, because there was essentially two streams of messages that were going around as the context for what has happened here. One being that on the one end, he was apparently due to officiate a same-sex marriage amongst two women. And, of course, he openly has said that is something that, well, we know that is something that he's been open to doing. But what may be the true picture of what had happened here was that he was also in Kabarga to marry, to officiate an interfaith marriage, for instance. And in this particular circumstance, again, what from the information that is within the public domain at the moment is that he was going to marry a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim or non-person, a person that isn't from, a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim man. And of course, the way my understanding, at least, of this is that it's the other way around, that one can be, it has to be a Muslim man and to a female that is a person of the book, for instance, in any of the major Abrahamic faiths, as it were. Now, in our understanding of saying there are people that practice and interpret things very differently and so on, and yes, there have been fatwas that have come out to say that what is being expressed in the lifestyle and that which people like Muhsin were advocating for, that is not in tandem or incongruent with Islam, that is out of the fold of what Islam so does highlight. We see again this ideological battles in the way some have reacted to Muhsin's murder to suggest that officiating an interfaith marriage in the way that we understand this may have happened, a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim man, for instance, that is about love and compassion and so on and so forth, and he was an advocate for that, and for that he ought not to have been killed. Perhaps you shouldn't. Yes, not perhaps. It is wrong. He should not have been murdered and killed. But is there a push in some form or the other to make Islam conform once again to the societal construct of saying this is what we understand by compassion and love and these sorts of things, and then surely the interpretation then be that it is fine for us to undo what are in very many respects almost Quranic prescripts that tells us what of course is allowed and what isn't, in a very simplistic way.
So there are a few questions, of course, you raise, and all important questions. But again, if you'll allow me, Tashrif, to just bring it back to the killing of Muhsin, because I think this is the fundamental, and not just Muhsin, for any person who would claim what is called homosexuality as an identity, right? So-called homosexuality as an identity. Let us again just say, all this on the question on the marriage of a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim man. These things are also speculation. As you said, this picture is still not clear. I mean, I think most people by now saw the video. Most people saw the two comments, whether it was officiating at a marriage in quote unquote in inverted commas, so-called marriage of two people of the same gender, or whether of a non-Muslim, a Christian or a Jewish or a Hindu, whatever man and a Muslim woman. All these are still speculation. That's number one. And I think it's important that we come back to that. Come back to what the investigation, the criminal investigation, will show, and we leave that to SEPS. Okay, because I think it's important that we emphasize this point, so that we'll know which perpetrators are. And as you also then point number two, the many comments on social media from Muslims, whether this way or that way, those who celebrating the killing of Muhsin Hendricks is wrong. Those Muslims, the doors of Jahannam must be open. That's all wrong. Let's put it that way. And those who support Muhsin. But what I want to, because there is no logical link again between the responses on social media after the event and the killing of Muhsin as to who the perpetrators were, and as to what their motives were and their motives are. So, for example, and it is wrong to kill a person for doing this. There's no hukum, there's no ruling in the Sharia that says you must kill a person for officiating at marriages, a person who officiates a marriage between a Muslim woman and a non-Muslim man. I read fatwas all the time. Timbuktu in the early 20th century, Muslim women got married to non-Muslim men, to French officials, to local other Africans who followed other religions. The ulama just said that marriage is not permissible, but nobody killed anybody. And this again is very important. This drawing a link between the contents of a fatwa and a particular action, again, has no logic or necessary link, and there's no methodology to it, nor is there any ethical consideration to it. May I ask the question here, Tashrif? If the assumption is that Muhsin was killed for either marrying off a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim man, if, and I emphasize that if, or if he was also officiating at a marriage of peoples of the same gender. If I may ask this question, how many marriages, and I'm asking this question genuinely, did Muhsin marry off before? If we say that this is the reason he was killed, if we find that to be the motive for his killing, how many did he do before? Perhaps we can ask that question, because if he did, and again, I'm emphasizing if he did before, then it means all those could then also then, the question of linking it to his killing. How many marriages did he officiate at before, at which, where he married off a Muslim woman to a non-Muslim man? The movie, for example, A Jihad for Love, was made back in 2007. I'm saying all these things because I'm asking, and again, I am not denying it as not that it was a Muslim who may have done it, or some Islamic fanatic, whatever some people call them. But again, it is just to try and see that we have to disturb, we have to problematize this linking it to Muslims, or linking it to an extremist Islamic discourse, because this in itself closes the door to dialogue. So tomorrow, if a person is asked, and we have established that it is wrong, Muhsin's killing was wrong, I've written somewhere, and that is why for his friends and for his family, it is fine to say condolences for them. Why? Because he was killed. He was murdered as a person, as a human being, and it is wrong to kill a human being. And that I would say that to his family and his friends. However, discussing, what Islam says, and let us, and for this moment, say there's a reading of Al-Quran Al-Kareem, and people will speak about interpretations, how to interpret this ayah and that ayah. That itself is part of a dialogue. Itself is part of a conversation. Now, for most Muslims who say that, listen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is clear in Al-Quran Al-Kareem that a union, an intimate union, or whether even a legal, what is like a marriage between people of the same two genders. And I here emphasize the word gender because I problematize the word sexuality, which we can discuss at another time, is not permissible. Now, if I, as a Muslim, and most Muslims take that position, what this means is that it makes most Muslims, the overwhelming number of Muslims, to be potential criminals. And you raise the question on compassion, all right? We raise a question on mercy. This Muslim woman being married off to this Muslim man. Incidentally, it also worked that a Muslim man, and there's the question of gender disparity accordingly. How can a Muslim man be married off to a Christian or a Jewish woman while it's not allowed for a Muslim woman? But it's also not allowed for a Muslim man, for example, to get married to a Hindu woman, to a woman who doesn't believe in Allah. So you see, the picture becomes a bit more nuanced, and often people, whether those who support the side of Muhsin's discourse, I'm not talking about his killing. Everybody must be agreed that Muslims' killing was wrong. It was not his appointed time to die. Okay. So now, if those who support his discourse or those that are against his discourse, whatever we do, what we should be, the killing is wrong, but there should be the conversation around what Al-Quran Al-Kareem and what Islam, and I say the Sunnah, I mean exemplary conduct and legacy of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam around those questions. So we need to ask more questions, and I'm not asking these questions as to how many people before Muslim married off or not, but we need to ask it not to run away, but because the matter cannot be treated simplistically and with this clinical surge, easiness, it seems, as both those who are supporters of Muhsin's discourse and those who are against him, as they appear to be treating it till now, at least.
Mm. And there's been some within the academia space and so on that come with what some would describe as very liberal arguments, suggesting that Muhsin was killed and he died as a martyr for love, as a martyr for this compassion, etc. How and using that particular premise, together with the claim here that, while yes, is murder is categorically, clearly unjustified, and there's no basis for such, that what some communities or some within this community is concerned about is that there are younger people that may feel this particular way, rightfully or wrongfully. That's not necessarily our conversation here today. But that you have people like Muhsin and others that have increasingly enabled that, and that increasingly what you sit with is what some would describe as the corrupting of the faith, as it were. And so for that, there ought to be, to a certain extent, no mercy shown for that. And when I say no mercy, again, I want to be very clear, it's not a justification for any sort of violence in any form or shape. I want to get a bit later to the way in which one then contemplates this beyond just, for instance, a dialogue, as you've highlighted, Sheikh, but I want to deal with the issue around, a judicial process and how Islam dictates that, for instance, ought to happen. But before we get to that particular element, I want to understand here the claim being made by some within the community that by allowing this to continue, you are then increasingly sitting with a scenario that more and more, particularly young people that feel this particular way, may be enabled by such behavior.
No, that in itself, on your last question, no. Of course, there are many issues that that have the potential to corrupt us. It's not only the question of so-called homosexuality. There are many, many other issues. There are many other issues. We can just look at, for example, what we view on TV, the media. So there are many other issues. So that cannot be a justification, for removing what one would be seeing corruption or those who enable corruption. As Ahmad Qasim used to say, rahmatullah alayhi, always, we fight ideas with better ideas. So no, and as I said, we have a long history. Listen to the ulama of Islam. Yes, there is the question, there are ayat in Quran that we can cite, and some will cite, like in Surah Al-Ma'idah, وَالَّذِينَ يَسْعُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا, those who spread corruption in the earth. There's a certain ayah, but we must read the Quran as a whole. Again, this is not the space to discuss this now, Tashri. But let me say on that, no, that is not. I mean, there are so many issues, things that corrupt us. I want to say to Muslim families, we react often, and not only to Muslim, even to Christian, to Jewish, and for those people, and most human beings, as far as, and I don't know statistics, but most human beings, at least theoretically, are still against the notion of same-gender unions. That appears to be the story. Right? Now, we in our homes, when you watch, for example, sitcoms, comedies, and there are two, for example, we see two men or two women in a relationship. We ourselves are part of normalizing a certain thing, but we don't see it. And here we need to question our own behavior, our own selves, as to what we permit. I'm citing this to say that because we then just want to blame one specific point or one specific person, and that's not going to help us to deal with the issue. But I want to be clear again. Now that in itself, then we have a discussion. And this is what dialogue means. Those like Muhsin Hendricks and his supporters for his discourse, here is where we need to talk. And therefore to come back. That is why people like Zaki Ahmad's response are unhelpful, are reactionary, because they don't come to the issue. They're not willing to sit on the table. And let me say it here, that many of the LGBTQI supporters are extremely intolerant. They don't want to have a discussion. So, for example, what is a homophobe? How do you define homophobe? What makes a person homophobe? The minute you say, let's have a Quranic discussion, even if you think that's my interpretation of the Quran, they're not willing to have a discussion. And so, but coming back, yes, there are many factors, there are many people, there are many discourses that corrupt faith. But the way that we do that is that we have discussion, that we ourselves read, we educate ourselves, we understand what the ideas are, what the world views are, what is the paradigm or the frameworks in which people discuss and which people articulate their particular positions. Then we have discussion. Islam and Muslims have a rich history of this. People like Imam Suyuti wrote, scholars wrote, how Muslims dealt with many of these questions. Right? So is there a judicial process? There are judicial processes for many things. I, to the best of my knowledge, am ignorant. Is there, for example, in Muslim discourses where so-called homosexuals, and this word we must problematize, this notion, this concept of homosexuality is a modern term. Let me say that first. Where I never read a fatwa yet, for example, in the pre-Islamic period, where a person was brought to Islamic court and sentenced to death. Yes, the fiqh, and not all fiqh. And again, you must problematize fiqh, because there are different views and opinions of the jurists, of the fuqaha, regarding on how to deal with a person who engaged in this act. Right? They differ. And most fuqaha do not say that person must be harmed. Most. There are some who say that, but that's a fiqh position, and we can discuss and we juxtapose that to the Quran. I haven't come across any judicial processes on how to deal with this. But to come back to the point is that, yes, we must be concerned about younger people. We must be worried about our children. Absolutely. And that is the right. It's not only the right, it is the duty of Muslims to be concerned and to be very worried around, the discourse of so-called homosexuality. But it is not right to go on killing people who ever killed Muhsin again, and whatever their motives were, on the assumption that it was a Muslim who killed Muhsin, on the assumption that the motive was to save Islam, and to stop corruption and everything, then that is not the way to go. The way to go is to say that let's have discussion. And again, I want to come back. I'm here not to flatter anyone who's called mujamala in Arabic. And this is why I'm saying Radio 786 have been doing this. not only 2 months ago, before that. And that is why this is the way to go. Our ulama also want to say, we must have discussions. Muhsin, to be fair, had discussions, I think, in 2007 with that Mufti A.K. Hussein, and I've now read and heard some take that this particular vitriol, his response to Muhsin's killing, that we disagree with. What I'm saying is that, so the way to go is to say that let us look, what does Sharia say? What is Sharia? What do the source of Sharia, starting with the Al-Quran Al-Kareem, say? But there must be a talk, there must be a dialogue that is frank. And this dialogue is based on Al-Quran and the exemplary conduct of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's not always going to favor some people. Some people are going to say, and I heard somebody saying, not only must we interpret, but reinterpret the sources. What does that mean? To reinterpret sources. And finally, you did say, is it to then let Sharia for now, be in conformity with social principles? Yes, there are those who have those, or the social conventions of the time. Yes, there are those who have that worldview. And therefore, we have to challenge that and say, but what are the social conventions? In the West, 50 years ago, so-called homosexuality was wrong. On what basis now do you say human rights? Whose human rights? Against which paradigm? Which worldview? What is the epistemological basis? And in a world of postmodernity where there are multiple truths, no. As Muslims, we believe in Allah, and we believe that Allah intervenes in history, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directs us. Sorry, I went in a very perhaps
but I think that's an important point to pivot very quickly to understand this idea of cherry picking, of course, ayat and different bits of fiqh, to push whatever one may feel very strongly and passionately about. Let's, for instance, look at, again, there being no foundational justification for the murder here, of course, of Muhsin, and together with the fact that there's no, Islam, of course, demands some sort of a due process, a just, process in which, when one, of course, has committed a crime, be it onto yourself or to others, that, there must be some sort of a judicial process. And as you said a bit earlier, there isn't quite that, at least you can point to, the way in which, through a judicial process, something like this, for instance, would have happened. And here's a listener, and I'm not certain if the listener is Muslim, but of course it's an anonymous question to ask, to say, would the gay Imam not have been stoned in the Middle East during prophetic time? How does one read and understand that? Because looking, of course, again at different ayats and things like that, I think it was in Surah 6, where Allah talks about, do not kill the soul which Allah has forbidden except by legal right. So how do we reconcile, yes, life is there's sanctity to it, and there's no justification, of course, for Muhsin's murder, but there are some pockets within our Muslim community that seems to feel that this is a price worth paying.
Firstly, no, Muhsin would not have been stoned on that question in the Prophet's time, because firstly there was no stoning to death. And this of course raises another question on stoning to death people who do adultery, of course, different genders. Again, that's another question. But to answer the question, no, Muhsin would not have been stoned to death. And I'm not saying these things apologetically, because I'm saying there's a system that was allowed. So there cannot be the assumption that Muhsin would have been stoned to death. Yeah, again, in the Muslim community, I'm saying if there are those who want to save Islam and Muslims, there are many, many issues. Many of those, and there are those people, and was problematized, and those Muslims want to go on and just kill certain people because of doing certain things. Again, we come to the idea that we contest ideas with better ideas, and that is that on the basis of the Quran and the exemplary conduct of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا in Surah Al-Anbiya. There is the best example for you in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's number one. And if people want to go on killing and then during apartheid, many of those who speak out were quiet, where we had to, for example, take up arms against a regime, because they. So we'll find so many incoherencies. But the point is, that now it is the time to dialogue. In the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he called the mushrikeen of Quraysh, those who worship gods other than Allah, those who swore at him, those, of course, there was a situation in the context of a clear battle where the Prophet fought, and any person who would have been confronted with the situation would have resorted to arms. But the fundamental Quranic concept is dialogue. In Surah As-Sab'ah, say to those people, either we or you are on the truth or in manifest error. The Prophet did not start by saying to the people of Quraysh, the mushrikeen of Quraysh, he did not say, I am on the truth. And he was on the truth. But he said, either we or you. This is the Quranic ayah, it's not a hadith. Quranic ayah, Surah, verse number 23 in Surah number 34. Now, if that is true, then, but let us speak. You present your argument and I will present my argument. Right. So those Muslims who just want to do what? To save Islam, how? There are so many wrong things in our country. There's economic exploitation. There are people who don't pay their workers. And I'm just trying to say that then we must go about, and there's so many things you have to correct. I want to perhaps just quickly, and as you say, Tashir, just come to cherry picking from Al-Quran Al-Karim. Also, and this is true for both the supporters of the LGBTQI discourse, so in other words, those who are Muslim and those who are against. When we approach Quran often, we have this atomistic approach to Quran. And we must problematize this approach to reading the Quran as an exegesis. You either should take out one ayah. That is not a nitpicking. It's a long in tafsir literature where the ulama starts, for example, the mufassirin begin with Surah Al-Fatiha and they end up min al-jinnati wan nas, and one ayah. That's not going to give us a complete and comprehensive picture of Al-Quran Al-Karim. So when and both these groups, by the way, as opposed as they are to one another, like they do this atomistic approach. We must put all the ayat together. For example, the story in this case, the narrative of Nabi Lut alayhi salam with his people, and then put it together. And when we want to understand Islam on the question of saying gender unions, on slavery, on the question on different ethnicities, on marriage, we must put all these ayat together. And therefore, people like ISIS, for example, they take one ayah from the Quran in Surah Tawbah, for example, ayah number 5, which Imam Suyuti called the sword verse himself, and say, you see, the Quran permits us to kill mushrikeen. Not looking at the ayat before it, the ayat after it, in that very surah, in that very spot, or other ayat in Al-Quran Al-Karim, so that we have a thematic approach to Al-Quran Al-Karim. And so this we must all problematize. Because here, what we are doing, we are imposing our ideologies, our ideological discourses on the Quran, and we silence the Quran. Even as we are sincere to the Quran, and when I say this, I don't mean that people are bad and evil. Hasha lillah. No, but I'm saying we have to problematize our own approaches to reading Quran, to understanding society. And therefore, perhaps just quickly, Tashri, the question on calling Muhsin Shahid. Now, let me say generally again.
Can you sorry, Sheikh, can you answer that question? Because some, again, within these liberal circles, speaks of Muhsin having advanced what they call liberation theology, right? So there's this idea of liberation theology, calling him a Shahid. And I'll add one more bit that you could also respond to is, and I see this a lot here on some of the responses from the listeners, is whether one can be an Imam and gay, and openly so.
So let me say liberation theology, yes. But liberation theology, of course, begins in South America at the end of the 1960s. So yes, liberation theology is a discourse. So that is a liberation theologian, yes. Some would, because liberation theology is a particular discourse that began as it was about the poor people, the impoverished people in Latin America. Right? People like Gustavo Gutierrez. And then it was broadened to include what were now called all other marginalized groups, including those who claim that, what they call a same-sexual identity. So yes, but what I'm saying is liberation theology, and I think it's a good thing. It's part of the things generally I'm speaking about, because it says that Allah cares for the poor. Allah cares for some people. But at the same time, liberation theology is a particular humanist discourse. It in itself does not constitute its own authenticity. So we can be critical of it. So that Muhsin Hendricks was the liberation theologian. Okay, that was it. But that does not mean now Muhsin is on the path of truth. Him and all those who within the paradigm of liberation theology are now justifying what they call same-sex sexuality and the permissibility of it, of those unions. So yes, right. To the question on Shahid, let me say generally, again, I come to the fiqh. And I don't put fiqh because I fetishize fiqh, or I think that fiqh is the end in its all. But fiqh says to me how the ulama over the centuries, and I think it's valuable because it tells us how Muslim scholars dealt with realities, how they understood their world, how they made sense of things. And let me say here again before I go further, the fuqaha are not immaculate. They were human beings too. They were mostly men, of course, and who were influenced by the society. Now, relation this to Shahid. Some of the fuqaha spoke about 3 types of Shahid, which they based on hadith also. And that's a different discussion. For example, the Shahidul Kamil, the person who's a Shaheed, the complete Shaheed, Shahidul Dunya wal Akhirah. And basically in Sunni fiqh is the person who dies in the battle, like in the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, and today, for example, in Palestine and in Lebanon, those in Palestine and in Lebanon and our Yemenis brothers who are fighting against Israeli, the enemy, right? So those people are Shaheed. Then they spoke about is called Shahidul Dunya, the person Shaheed of the Dunya, a person when a criminal invades your house, a person who tries to kill your family, and you fight and you defend yourself and your family and your property, your wealth, yes, your wealth, and that person kills you. That person is also Shaheed, right? That person is called Shahidul Dunya, the Shahidul Dunya, because that person was not exactly ala kalimatillah, like the first, to make supreme the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That person defended himself or defended another person, a woman or a man was attacked, and then and we can disagree with it, but I'm just giving categories. The third type is Shahidul Akhirah, is a person who drowns, is a person who was murdered, is a person who burned in a fire, is a person, there are many categories. The Hanbali school, for example, there are 20 types of Shahidul Akhirah, etc. Now, any person murdered, let me say Shaheed, but this in itself does not give that person a particular status, just that this person was unjustly murdered. However, in this context, the same fuqaha would also say, was this person killed for ma'siyah? Ma'siyah means wrong. And then, of course, we have to go into ma'siyah. My problematizing, my critique of the discourse that makes Muhsin a Shaheed is that this is an ideological approach. Now, what they're doing, for example, they comparing, what is called, or what they call the struggle of LGBTQI people on the same level as Palestine, on the same level as the anti-racism struggle. And here, let's have the dialogue and say that no, we disagree with that designation. So their designation of Muslim is in line with him struggling for truth against a falsehood. And that falsehood translates into bigotry, extremism. Those Muslims who are just bigots, who are just extremists. And let me say, and that's why I come back to the question, who are homophobic. And what is homophobic? Homophobic is not necessarily, and we should not harm any people like that. It is wrong, it is haram, right? That was clearly set out. But even if you say that the Quran says it is not permissible, that makes you a homophobe. If you say that the Quran says it is not permissible for a man to be in a union with a man and a woman to be in a union with a woman, that makes you a homophobe. So using this application of Shaheed is an ideological discursive, it's a discursive application, that's what I'm going to say. And therefore, this is the LGBTQI, that this guy, and he represented a cause, he represented liberation theology, justice for people, and that is problematic, and that is what we problematize. So therefore, I am not using, and I would not use the word Shaheed for Muhsin. On the question of Imam, this is interesting, right? Because Imam has got a very big social meaning in Cape Town. The word Imam in Islamic, especially political literature, and even the Quran that I'll come to, means leader, the one who stands in front. That is the designation of the word Imam. The Quran speaks about, and this is interesting, the Quran speaks about A'immatul Khair, about good Imams and evil Imams. The Quran calls Fir'aun and his like Imams. That these were Imams, A'immatul Shar. In Surah Tawbah, Allah says, Qatilu A'immatul Kufr. Now, please, I'm citing this ayat not to apply it here in this immediate context now to Muhsin or anyone. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying that it's interesting because, and this means how we read the Quran. In Surah Tawbah, it says, Qatilu A'immatul Kufr. fight the imams of kufr, in other words, the leaders of kufr. I want to again emphasize Tashriq. And some, I would hope some don't interpret it that way, that I'm now saying and linking to Muhsin. I am not. Right? But in Cape Town, especially in South Africa, the word imam is a very special meaning. We give different meanings. It's not always the meaning of the word, but the usage of the word, as Wittgenstein would have said. That in Cape Town, the imam is that person who cares for the community. You know how special the imam in Cape Town was. The imam buries us. The imam marries of our children. The imam does the doopmaal, giving names, etc. So this also and that's also problematic for me. I would not say imam for Muhsin, and I'm not trying to be unkind, because imam in Cape Town has a very, very deep meaning. It's not just any person. Now we can talk about the faults and the mistakes. I'm not here elevating the imams in Cape Town to some position. They are human beings, right? That's number one. But I'm trying to say, and therefore this insistence on it, because the imam does provide leadership and did over the almost 400 years in Cape Town. Yes, we can be critical of some imams who didn't speak out, and we should be critical. We didn't speak out against apartheid, injustice and apartheid racism, but imams played an extremely important role. They kept our communities together. They were part of teachings for cohesion, for social cohesion, for caring the Muslim communities, for guiding Muslim communities. They may not have had, some of them, all the knowledge and stuff, but they're very important. And therefore, it's not that when people link Muhsin to Imam, it's because he's now leading what is called the community. I've said before, we cannot speak about LGBTQI community, because once we say community, we afford it a particular status, a social legitimacy. And that's a point I also disagree on. Yeah. And that's why I just speak about the LGBTQI discourse. And so, and so for me, it's important to see again how the what you call the Tashriq, the liberal discourse of LGBTQI, also uses certain concepts that are very much entrenched, that are part of Muslim tradition, to show that Muslim Muhsin and people like him, who follow his discourse, have this leadership. And therefore, those who are opposing them, their ideas then to come to that Muhsin, that we are opposing the community. What is under dispute here is a particular discourse. It's a discourse that says, and a liberation theology is a discourse, and that moves from a particular worldview that is not the Islamic worldview. And therefore, I want to say about academia or Muslim academics, they are part of the Muslim community.
Yeah.
They don't have any special place,
Yeah. And then just in summary, within 30 seconds or so, we need to dialogue, we need to talk, we can disagree in how we see things, but none of which justifies the way in which Muhsin was killed in Gqeberha last weekend.
Absolutely. And in that way, yes, the South African state must take its role, the South African government, SEPs must, and we must not comment as Muslims. Let us just keep our it is good. Man kana yu'min billahi wal yawm al-akhir falyaqul khayran aw liyasmut aw fi riwaya aw liyaskut. If you really believe in Allah on the last day, let us say good. And as good here means we say what is based on evidence, what is truth, what is carefully thought out, or let us keep quiet. And in that part I agree with Zaki Ahmad. But to now come, and so Zaki Ahmad is on the opposite side of the scale, but it sits on the same level as those who are saying must go to Jahannam, because Zaki Ahmad and people like him are now saying the state must clamp down on those Muslims. And it's not only those few extremist Muslims, but the whole Muslim discourse. And that is problematic. But Tashriq, as you said, and again, I want to end off by commending Radio 786 for having done this for the past 30 years and always taking up these questions. And Radio 786 doesn't give the answers, doesn't have all the answers, but it says, let's talk. The Quran, Allah's Sunnah, the prophets of all the Anbiya, the Sunnah is, let's talk. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheikh Shahid Mathee from the Department of Religion Studies at the University of Johannesburg on the line there.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.